When talking about Buddhism, I noted in the last lecture that Buddhists are somewhat deterministic. They see the world as being a chain of cause and effect, and the world as continuously in flux, and that flux is governed by a chain of causation. And Buddhists and Hindus have this in common, this idea that there is karma, which would involve the energy emanating out of our actions and our intentions that condition or cause future events. And Buddhists even think that the ego or the I is not the one. It doesn't come out of nothing. It also is part of a chain of prior causes. So I wanted to talk right now about the Pattica-Samuppada. This goes beyond the text a bit, and this is the chain of causation for Buddhists. So it's 12 causal states of the individual, and each one determines the next. So it will get to the birth of the ego or the sense of I by looking at this chain of causation. The first step in the chain is ignorance. And we can see a correlation here with Hinduism when they talk about levels of reality, the first being non-existence. Same thing, when we talk about the self, we start from the non-existence of the self or the ignorance of the self. So at this point, there is no sense of I, no sense of an ego. And where we go from ignorance is to mental elements. And this is where we start to experience formations. Okay, so you think about a baby that just being born. They start from a state of ignorance, and then they're born into the world, and they start to experience things. They're perceiving things with the eyes, and they have no concept yet of what that is. They have no way of organizing it in their mind, but they're experiencing formations. Okay, from that emerges consciousness. And that's when our mind starts conceptualizing those formations, and we start to see them as something. Okay, so the formations are things, and that's where we can say distinguish the hard surface that I'm laying on from the ceiling that I'm looking upon. We can distinguish one thing as being dissimilar or radically different from another thing. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. This is a very basic, rudimentary sense of consciousness, and one that even animals, would have. As my dogs can distinguish food from non-food. Okay, and then from consciousness we get mind and body. Okay. We develop a sense of mind as consciousness as distinct from body. And this is the birth of dualistic thinking. Okay. The mind, of course, is immaterial. It involves mental states. The body is material and it's physical. So, the classic mind-body dualism in Western philosophy is consciousness versus a brain, and philosophers for hundreds of years have been trying to figure out how the two are related, or if they're related at all. And that's something we'll explore later in the class too. Okay, but then from there we become aware of senses. Okay. We become aware of our senses as distinct. So within the realm of the mind and consciousness, we have taste, and we have sound, and we have touch, and so on. Okay, and remember, this is a chain of causation. So one level, causes the next. So senses arises out of a sense of mind versus body. Okay, then from senses we get contact. we come into contact with the world. And this is where the birth of empiricism. We start to think that we know things by interacting and making contact with that world. Okay? Empiricism is the philosophical theory that you gain knowledge through the senses. Okay, so Buddhists are good empiricists here. They, from your sense of mind versus body arises the senses, and then you start using your senses to gain knowledge. Okay, so we start to feel the world. Well, as we feel the world, then we start to, from what emerges from that is craving and aversion. Okay. We start to develop tastes for things. Through our contact with food, we start to crave, dessert, and we start to be averse to broccoli. I have a 4-year-old, so of course, in the early days, you could feed him anything. Just give him a bunch of carrots, give him broccoli. He was eating amazingly well, better than I eat. But then as he became more sophisticated, from that contact with the world and that continuous experimentation that he had with food came tastes. So now he doesn't like to eat green things, a classic example. Can't feed, actually he'll eat broccoli, but I cannot feed him leafy green things. He is averse to them. And of course he craves, things that we all crave, really tasty things. But he does like, what am I thinking of? He does really like vinegary things. So anyway, he has some interesting tastes himself. But you see the point. You start to want things. Okay. From there grows clinging. And that is goes beyond just craving something. It can, it essentially is a source of suffering. We saw in the second noble truth of Buddhism that the source of suffering is in ignorant craving. Another way to translate that is in clinging. Okay, so it goes beyond just craving, but really wanting this or that, and through clinging, we become a self. What is the ego except one who has certain specific desires? I am a philosopher, so I want to make a living doing philosophy. I cling, to that goal. What am I but I'm the person who likes this kind of food or that kind of food, and you start to identify yourself with that which you crave, incessantly crave. Okay, so this is where the growth of the ego is born. Okay, where you start to become a self, and that self is that which your self clings to. Okay, same same. You identify yourself in a family. You start out craving, your parents, and then you start clinging to your identity as being part of that family. Okay, so that's where becoming comes in, and then we see birth. The distinct birth of a distinct ego. The mic, is born at that moment, and then we see a cycle happening. Remember, everything is impermanent for Buddhists. So with birth comes old age, and with old age after time comes death. And the cycle continues. So from death arises ignorance. And Buddhists have, a belief in reincarnation. So you could take this literally as an entire lifespan, from the moment you are conceived till you start to, have the capability for perception, to when you become conscious, etc., until you become a person, and a specific person and then that person grows old and eventually dies, and then is reincarnated into a new body. But you could also look at this within a lifespan. I mentioned in the first lecture the idea of the reborn religious person. Okay, well, this whole cycle sort of renews with within a lifetime. When you see your old self, the the person prior to being reborn, that person dies. Well, they have to start, in a way, ignorant, relearning, learning new concepts, learning new ways of looking at the world, and developing from there new distinct cravings, and clinging to a new sense of self that is then born. So you can also look at this not just as an entire life, but within a lifespan. And we're constantly going through, change. And with that, the ego is constantly changing and altering. Okay, so the Buddhist, the Buddhist philosophy says that you can break this chain of causation, because so long as you're swept up in it, you are suffering. So the idea is that using the Eightfold Path, you can break this chain of causation. So you're no longer swept up in, a wave of cause and effect. Okay, rather at that point, you are no longer subject to constant change and constant flux. You reach a state of equanimity, which is a state of enlightenment where, similar to the story from the Bhagavad Gita, you attain a mental state that no longer has you thinking dualistically. Okay, and so of course, the Buddhist idea is that you break the chain of causation by breaking this step right here, where you go from craving to clinging. Okay, so the Buddhist can crave certain things. Buddhists like certain kinds of food, but they no longer cling to having certain kinds of food. So they no longer suffer when that kind of food isn't in front of them. And food is a simple example, but you might crave a good reputation, but there's a difference between desiring a good reputation and clinging to it. So if you don't feel like you get the respect, so long as you're clinging to that respect, you suffer. But if you can break this off here, then that craving or desire for suffering no longer becomes that desiring of reputation no longer becomes a source of suffering, because you don't grasp onto it, you don't cling to it, and with that, you no longer identify yourself with it. Okay, so I talked about no self in Buddhism, the idea that there is no ego that's governing things. The ego is essentially an effect of prior causes, an effect of our natural inclination to crave, which then drives us to cling to things. So if you break this chain of causation and no longer cling, then you also lose your commitment to being a certain kind of self. All right, this is complex, non-Western, so unfamiliar philosophy. So please send me messages, emails, if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about here.